Have you ever read or heard stories in the Old Testament and thought, God doesn't seem at all that happy? We need to understand one crucial fact. The God of the Old Testament is often portrayed as wrathful, judging humanity for their sins, infidelity, and disobedience. But is this anger solely about retribution, or is it deeper? During the ancient times, the Israelites were surrounded by cultures that often viewed their deities as capricious and easily angered. This was a world influenced by a belief in divine justice that equated moral failure with punishment. However, the Old Testament presents a God who demands fidelity and righteousness from his people, setting an incredibly high standard. Welcome, as we explore the stories behind the angry God of the Old Testament. To begin, we head on to the first book of the Old Testament, the book of Genesis. In the first chapter of Genesis, we see God creating everything we see in paradise, including the creation of man based on his own image and likeness to take care of his creation. But then we move on to chapter 3, and we have a serpent, and Adam and Eve being cast out of the Garden of Eden for eating the forbidden fruit. And then there is the story of Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother Abel out of jealousy. God then curses Cain to not be able to yield produce and to wander the earth and never die. And then there is also the Great Flood. The flood that cleansed the earth of humanity's wickedness and corruption. Only Noah, a righteous man, and his family, and a pair of every kind of animal would be saved from the impending flood. So in the very beginning, we see God's anger erupt in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve break the one commandment they were given: do not eat from the tree of knowledge. The result: exile from paradise. Here, God is not just angry, he's enacting justice to restore balance. It's a hard lesson, but one aimed at guiding humanity. But it doesn't stop there. The story of Cain and Abel is another fascinating illustration. Cain, out of jealousy, commits the first murder. God's anger leads to Cain's punishment, an act of justice that forces him to become a wanderer. It sounds harsh, but consider this: a society without accountability can spiral into chaos. So, is it fair to say that God's anger is less about wrath and more about a desperate desire to restore order? The flood narrative further exemplifies this idea. God wasn't just angry. He was grieved by humanity's rebellion, leading to a fresh start through Noah. It's a pattern of destruction and recreation. Let's not forget the broader narrative. Genesis sets the stage for a relationship between God and humanity. This relationship is filled with love, disappointment, and ultimately an unwavering quest for reconciliation. God's anger is a motivator, not just as a reaction, but as a call to righteousness. Then we move on to the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus tells us the story of the Israelites, enslaved in Egypt, and the fierce, unrelenting response God has toward the Pharaoh. We've all heard of the 10 plagues: blood, frogs, locusts, you name it. But here's the big question. Why such extreme measures? Was it sheer anger, or was there a divine purpose behind it all? When we look at the plagues, it's easy to see them as mere acts of vengeance. But think about this. The Pharaoh repeatedly hardened his heart against the Israelites, refusing to grant them freedom. In these moments, God's anger was ignited not just for retribution, but to bring about justice for the oppressed. The oppression of the Israelites wasn't just cruelty to individuals, it symbolized a broader assault on justice and moral order. God wasn't acting out of whim. According to the text, this anger was a response to systematic injustice. We see anger as a natural, even necessary, reaction when witnessing deep injustice. So why shouldn't God? This brings us to another critical aspect. God's anger comes with a purpose, liberation, and covenant. In Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 to 6, he tells the people, "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession." Here, anger transforms into an invitation for relationship. His wrath signifies a commitment to justice, entwined with love. And that's a different angle to consider, right? We now move to the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy is primarily a set of sermons delivered by Moses to the Israelites. Imagine a community at a crossroads just on the brink of entering the promised land, Canaan, after years of wandering in the wilderness. Their future hangs in the balance, but what does Moses tell them? Throughout Deuteronomy, you might notice that God comes off as, well, angry quite a bit. But if we dig deeper, it's critical to understand the why behind that anger. It's not arbitrary. It's rooted in love and care for his people. One key element we often overlook is the concept of covenant. In Deuteronomy, God is laying out the terms of this sacred agreement. The constant reminders of consequences are not about punishment. They are about maintaining the relationship and honoring the commitment. It's like saying, if you care for me, we need to work together here. Now let's talk about the discomfort of divine anger. It's easy to dismiss God's stern voice, but could it also signify a call to accountability? When you look at the history of the Israelites, their actions often lead to dire consequences, not just for themselves, but for future generations. Then we take a look at the book of Judges. The book of Judges spans a turbulent era for the Israelites, a time when they were settling into the promised land. But instead of peace, they face cycles of rebellion, oppression, and despair. So why does God respond with such fiery anger? It all starts with the covenant, a sacred agreement promising protection and blessings in return for loyalty. The narrative in Judges is like a broken record, spinning through a cycle. The Israelites sin. They face oppression from their enemies. They cry out to God. And then he sends a deliverer. Repeat. It's like watching a horrifying movie where the characters just don't learn from their mistakes. One has to understand, God's anger isn't arbitrary. It's a response to their infidelity and the consequences of their choices. Each time the Israelites turn away, they invite chaos into their lives. Think of it this way. Would you sit idly by while someone you care about repeatedly hurt themselves? God's anger is a reflection of his deep love and desire for his people to walk in a way that brings life and not destruction. So why is the God of the Old Testament always angry? It's not just about vengeance or punishment. It's about maintaining a relationship, upholding justice, and calling for accountability. Each act of anger is an integral part of a larger story about who we are, how we relate to the divine, and the constant opportunity for redemption. God's anger may be fierce, but his purpose ultimately shines bright, a commitment to care for the oppressed in a world that often overlooks them. In our lives, we too can fall into cycles, bad habits, toxic relationships, or destructive patterns. The anger is not just God's. It echoes in our own frustrations when we see ourselves or others making the same mistakes. But the beauty lies in the fact that there is always a chance to turn back, to repent. Just like those ancient Israelites had deliverers, we have mentors, guides, and even the wisdom of the past. The question is, are we ready to listen? And then, learn. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss the question, why is the Old Testament God always angry? And remember, please keep asking why on YouTube.